The mail arrived every afternoon at 3:12, exactly. Sarah knew this because she had started timing it, counting the seconds between the low hum of the delivery van and the soft thunk of the metal box closing. It became a ritual, something to latch on to as the days blurred and the neighborhood grew silent. The cul-de-sac where she lived hadn't always been this quiet. Kids used to ride bikes past her window, neighbors used to wave, sprinklers hissed on weekends. But it had been weeks since Sarah saw anyone at all. The cars were still parked in driveways, the lights in houses still flicked on and off. But the people, they were just gone. She had tried to tell herself she was overthinking things, clutching her coffee as her gaze lingered on the empty street. But there was one thing she couldn't explain. Her mail didn't belong to her. Catalogs and envelopes still came every day without fail, neat and pristine, addressed to names she didn't recognize, names that didn't live on her street. She decided to leave her home one evening, clutching a stack of misplaced letters in her hand. The sun was low, casting long golden shadows over the manicured lawns. Maybe she'd knock on a few doors, ask questions, find some answers. Yet the moment her foot stepped onto the pavement, she hesitated. The vacant sidewalks seemed to stretch endlessly, like they would never end no matter how far she walked. She forced her legs to move, trying Ashley Bennett's house first. She and Ashley used to chat at block parties, bond over gardening tips. But now the windows were dark, and the air around the door felt heavier than it should. Still, Sarah knocked, and knocked again. She thought she saw movement once, the flicker of a shadow behind the sheer curtain. Her voice caught in her throat as she called Ashley's name and was met with nothing but her own echo. Stepping back, she noticed something peculiar. The doormat, usually neatly in place, had been brushed slightly aside, revealing deep grooves scratched into the concrete underneath. Her unease deepened as she tried 2 more houses with identical outcomes. No answer, no sounds, only strange marks in the doorways or on the porches. A flutter of panic tightened in her chest when she turned and found that her own home, just 50 feet across the street, looked different. The soft glow of her living room, which she knew she'd left on, was dim, flickering. Her heart raced as she caught sight of something shifting through the window. A silhouette moving across the room, too broad-shouldered to be hers. Who was inside? She stumbled back toward the nearest house, peering through the window for help. But all she found was a faint impression of faces pressed into the dust of the glass pane. They weren't moving, just staring. It felt like the entire neighborhood was holding its breath, its stillness pressing down on her. The pile of letters in her hand slipped and scattered across the pavement, and for the first time, she noticed the red ink stamped on each of them. There were no addresses at all. Just one word, unclaimed. Adrenaline took over as she ran, stumbling over curbs and pushing blindly through the street. Her thoughts were loud, but the world itself was utterly silent, the kind of silence that clawed at her ears. She fumbled with her keys as she reached her door, desperate to get inside, but stopped cold when her palm brushed against the doorknob. It was warm. From inside, she heard the faintest sound, like someone flipping through the pages of a book. She smelled something too, familiar and acrid, like the smoke of a candle wick just snuffed out. Summoning what courage she had left, she twisted the knob and stepped inside, her legs trembling. The living room was empty, mostly. The furniture was still there, her pictures still hung on the walls, but something intangible had shifted, like the boundary between her and the house had blurred. The flickering light came from her TV, now showing static. And there, on the coffee table, was a single envelope she didn't remember leaving out. Hands shaking, she picked it up. It wasn't addressed to her. It was addressed to the next occupant. The forest stretched endlessly, trees towering like ancient sentinels against the gray sky. Lena had agreed to join the hiking trip reluctantly, more out of social obligation than genuine interest. But now, hours after becoming separated from the group, the realization sat heavy in her chest. She was utterly alone. She checked her phone for the 100th time, tilting it to catch a faint signal, but the only reply was the silent glow of 0 bars. The sun waned behind a blur of dusk, and an uncanny stillness pressed in, unnatural for a place alive with wildlife. The deeper Lena wandered in search of a landmark, the more disoriented she became. Every tree started to look deliberate, unnervingly similar, as though the forest were folding in on itself. Twice she swore she'd seen movement at the corner of her vision, just a flicker, like a limb shifting or a shadow darting between trunks, only for nothing to be there when she turned her head. When night took hold, the absence of light became an entity in itself, dense and suffocating. The narrow cone of Lena's flashlight scanned the dense pines, revealing nothing yet making her feel watched all the same. At first, the whispers were faint, more like the rustling of wind. They grew louder the further she walked, though the air was still, not even a chill breeze passing through. When she paused, so did the sound. When she moved, it resumed. Panic began to smear the edges of her thoughts, muddying her ability to think clearly. Lena told herself it was her imagination, her fear playing tricks on her, but her breathing came shallow, her ears straining for any anomalies that betrayed another presence. It wasn't until she accidentally looked down that her composure cracked completely. There, etched in the dirt beneath her boots, were fresh, deliberate boot prints. They weren't hers. Lena's mind raced as she stumbled through the thickets, her pulse hammering as if her body already knew something her mind refused to accept. She yelled now, desperate shouts for her friends or anyone within earshot, but her cries bounced back hollowly, swallowed by the oppressive trees. Scanning the ground with her flashlight became terrifying. The prints lingered, always a few steps behind her. She thought she saw something further away, a flicker of white like clothing, but it dissolved when her flashlight veered in its direction. The whispers, no longer restrained, swirled around her in incoherent murmurs, distinct from any rustle of leaves or chirp of nocturnal creatures. It felt human, several voices overlapping, surrounding her, but garbled, as if spoken underwater. A smell reached her next, faintly metallic, sharp enough to sting her nostrils, though she couldn't place its source. Above all, the sound of footsteps, quick, rhythmic, unmistakable, echoed faintly behind her, pressing closer with impossible consistency, no matter how fast or erratically she moved. The clarity came slowly, insidiously, as Lena skidded to a halt in a small clearing choked with moss and jagged roots. She bent over, hands on her knees, trying to catch her breath while listening intently. For a moment, an eerie quiet returned, and she dared to wonder if the pursuer, if it had ever been real, had given up the chase. Then something clicked in her mind. Not a memory, but a realization. She had passed this same clearing before. Same gnarly roots, same crooked trunk. She was circling, or worse, being circled. Before she could process it fully, the flashlight flickered, faltered, and died, plunging her into absolute blackness. Her teeth clenched to stifle a scream as the whispers surrounded her again. But their tone had changed. The murmurs weren't random anymore. They were words, her name, hissed over and over. A cold proximity bristled against her neck, heavier than breath, as something unseen moved just behind her, silent, deliberate, waiting, as if entertained by how long she would resist turning around. Marian first noticed the sound late one rainy afternoon, a rhythmic creak that seemed to pulse in time with the faint drumming of water on the roof. She stood motionless in the narrow hallway, her eyes anchored to the dark oak cupboard standing at the end beneath a dim light fixture. It was an old piece, inherited when her grandmother passed, its surface scarred by age. The sound wasn't loud, but it wasn't faint either, somewhere in the in-between, as if carefully measured to reach her ears, yet not loud enough to warrant opening the heavy doors. She stared at it, waiting for the creak to repeat itself, but all she heard was the rain and her own shallow breathing. Just as her pulse began to calm, the sound came again, low, deliberate, and impossibly alive. The creaks became a nightly occurrence. At first, Marian told herself it was the house settling or the wood contracting in the damp weather. Beginnings are always so innocuous, she thought, as if reasoning with the unease growing like moss in her chest. Nevertheless, she started avoiding the hallway after dark, bypassing the cupboard with hurried strides, and studiously avoiding eye contact with its carved patterns and brass handles. She noticed, too, how the light above it flickered erratically whenever she was near. One evening, braver than most or simply wearied by fear, she leaned down to inspect the base of the cupboard. There was nothing unusual to be seen, but when she bent closer, she caught the unmistakable scent of salt water drifting from the thin crack between its doors. Determined to confront whatever this was, Marian decided to open it one morning when the sun cast soft beams into the hallway. She wrapped her trembling hands around the cold brass handles and tugged. At first, it wouldn't budge as though suctioned shut. When it finally gave way, the doors opened smoothly, silently, almost reverently. The inside was emptier than she expected, shadow-soaked and deep. A low breath of air brushed past her face like the reedy exhale of something ancient. No noises followed. No hidden passages were revealed. It was utterly normal, unremarkable, unexplainable. She sighed in reluctant relief and left the doors ajar, determined to dismantle her paranoia piece by piece. That night, the creaks didn't return. And for the first time in days, she fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. By morning, she couldn't remember waking up, yet she found herself standing barefoot in the hallway. Both cupboard doors were shut tight again, defying her memory. She blinked drowsily, the faint taste of salt on her lips. When her hand reached to open the doors once more, something stopped her mid-motion. Not a sound or a movement, but a suffocating stillness. The entire house, for the first time since she'd lived there, felt utterly silent. She stepped back, her skin prickling with static, and turned towards the safety of her bedroom. But just as she moved away, she felt something cold, a slick droplet grazing her palm. She glanced down and saw a single bead of water sliding from her fingers. Behind her, the cupboard groaned softly, as though shifting to a more comfortable position.